Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It is Sunday, March 16th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with political correspondent Sam Sokol. Hi, Sam. How you doing?
Morning.
Good morning. It is day 527 of the war. As Israel slammed the latest Hamas proposal to free one living hostage, U.S. citizen Idan Alexander, and 4 slain hostages, the Prime Minister's office Saturday night said that its current proposal that is in the works would see 11 living hostages freed immediately and half of the slain hostages. The Israeli negotiating team is still in Doha, Qatar, working on those negotiations. Thousands attended protests for the hostages in Tel Aviv and across the country Saturday night, calling for a one-time release of all the remaining captives. Meanwhile, U.S. strikes on Yemen killed 31 people, and the Houthis have vowed a response, while U.S. President Donald Trump said the U.S. will hold Tehran accountable if the U.S. is threatened in the ongoing back and forth between the U.S. and Iran. And then locally, or here in Israel, there is the state budget with a March 31st deadline and a lot of tension between the ultra-Orthodox members of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition, who have threatened to vote against it without legislation of sweeping exemptions of military service for Haredi yeshiva students. We will talk about that, as well as Sam's investigation into a seemingly growing ecosystem of Haredi organizations aimed at promoting military draft evasion. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Okay, Sam, so March 31st is in exactly 15 days. By law, the budget has to be passed or the government will fall. That is Netanyahu's coalition government that includes quite a few ultra-Orthodox parties. And for them, as we've been saying, as we've been discussing, the Achilles heel, one of the subjects that matters most are exemptions for yeshiva students. And what these Haredi parties are looking for, which you've discussed many times on the podcast, are legislation that will be passed that will offer sweeping exemptions to military service. And of course, this is during a war that is not over, as the IDF, as the army, is actually looking to do a sort of a slowed call up to reservists who have served 100, 200, 300, 400 days. And there is a desperate need for more people, more bodies in the army. So before we go into your investigation that really digs even deeper into this ecosystem, tell us what you're hearing, what you've been reporting over the last week about the Haredi parties and their insistence on legislation or they will vote against the budget.
Long story short, the Haredim are incredibly insistent on getting this legislation passed as fast as possible. The IDF has told the Knesset that the military requires 12,000 new soldiers, 7,000 of whom need to be combat troops. And in fact, they are so hard up for troops that they are now starting to lower the medical requirements for soldiers to serve in combat roles. Now, the ultra-Orthodox, for their part, have essentially said, or at least parts of the ultra-Orthodox have said, that without a bill regulating enlistment, essentially giving them the exemptions that were struck down by the High Court of Justice last year, they will not allow the budget to pass. Now, the Haredim have been very divided on this. On the one hand, within the United Torah Judaism Party, which represents Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox Jews, you have the Hasidic Agudat Yisrael part, and you have the so-called Lithuanian or non-Hasidic Degel HaTorah faction. Now, Agudat Yisrael, which is run by party chief Yitzchak Goldknopf, has said explicitly that its MKs will vote against the budget if they don't get this law passed in a very short time period. Now, Degel HaTorah has apparently been a little more pragmatic and has said that they would prefer to wait on any threats or any sort of ultimatums until after the passage of the budget. Similarly, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox Shas party has previously threatened to vote against the budget, but very quickly made a 180 and has said there's no threat, there's no ultimatum. So this is, I think all of the ultra-Orthodox parties want the same thing, but there's a very big rift internally in terms of the tactics that they believe are useful to get there.
And Sam, do we have a sense of numbers of what this would actually look like if it comes down to a vote? Do we have a sense of that yet, or it's too soon to tell?
Assuming that the Agudat Yisrael party, or faction, I should say, goes through with its threat, that would mean that 3 out of 61 members of the coalition would be voting against the budget. That's enough to prevent the budget's passage. However, it's unclear what Agudat Yisrael will actually do when it comes to crunch time. They've made threats relating to the budget before to hold it up in different stages and have generally backed down. And on a purely pragmatic level, it would seem that it would be against their interests to actually bring the government down, because an opposition-led government would not be as amenable to them on these issues and on other important issues to them. And it really is unclear at this point if they'll actually follow through. A lot of it comes down to the individual orders of the individual rabbis who give orders to each of the members of this coalition, of this faction, I mean. Keep in mind that as a Hasidic party, each of their MKs is representing a different Hasidic faction with a different Rebbe. So, people outside the Haredi community tend to see it as a bit monolithic, but Haredi politics are essentially fractal, which makes predicting them a little more complicated at times.
I hear you. Okay, let's take a quick break, and when we're back, let's dig into your investigation and hear more about that and what it really portends for all of this. Stay with us. Okay, so the investigation into this ecosystem, as you've described it, a growing ecosystem of ultra-Orthodox organizations that are aimed at promoting military draft evasion. I was curious first, is what first tipped you off to it? What first led you to look into it?
Well, as a reporter, often you're receiving press releases and statements throughout the day, every day. So your phone is always going off. You're always being deluged with material. And on occasion, you miss something. And on one of those occasions, I received a press statement from a spokesman for Minister Meir Porush, a minister in Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet, on behalf of the Agudat Yisrael faction of UTJ. And when I finished reading it, I noticed a previous message I had missed from a couple weeks before, which was a transcript of a talk that Porush had given at a meeting of political activists, a faction within the faction. Remember, fractal politics. So he was at a meeting of his faction within the faction that's part of the larger party. And he announces that Agudat Yisrael, at an institution that he controls from Agudat Yisrael in Jerusalem, had opened up a hotline to help people who were in danger of being enlisted in the IDF. That's the word he used. He wants to help people who turn to him to deal with the, quote, danger of conscription, unquote. And, this sort of rang a bell, because the question is, what advice can you give anybody under the previous set of rules, which were struck down by the government? Enlistment was regulated by something called a concept called Torato Umanuto. The Torah is his profession. Essentially, if you could show that you were learning full-time in yeshiva, then you could legally get an exemption. However, since that was struck down, there's no real legal mechanism for getting someone out of the army. So I wondered, what kind of advice could they be giving people that would both be effective and legal? So I call them up, identify myself as a journalist, and I ask them. And what they tell me is that they cannot give any advice for young men of draft age. The only thing that they're doing is providing pro bono legal service for older people who might have various family situations that could serve as the basis for an exemption, unrelated to the fact that they are their yeshiva students. For instance, if you have a guy in his late 20s married with kids and one of the kids has a significant health problem. So I decided to check, and I had members of the ultra-Orthodox community with whom I'm in touch call the hotline to ask either for advice for themselves or for their children, people who were actually in that situation for the most part. And what emerged was a pattern of behavior. One person who called and said, my son got a draft order, what do I do? Was told not only to, quote, ignore it and not deal with it, but was told to lie to the IDF. My son never saw the order. My son's unaware of the draft order. My son, I'm not in touch with my son day to day. I don't know where he physically is. And then he's told to tell his son, don't answer the phone. Don't go to any demonstrations where you could come into contact with the police, to give them an excuse to see that he is a draft dodger. One 19-year-old yeshiva student said, when he asked, what do? I got an order. He's told, relax, come back to us for more advice. When you get an arrest warrant against you, come back to us. And you have to understand that according to the Israeli Penal Code, encouraging somebody to dodge the draft and become a deserter during a period of war, if convicted, the mandatory sentence is 15 years in prison. This is a very serious criminal offense. And what I discovered during the course of working on this story is that there's a growing ecosystem. If you start to read the ultra-Orthodox media, all of the party newspapers and newspapers affiliated with different groups in the ultra-Orthodox community, you see a sort of this growing web of groups. They're not necessarily working together. It's not part of some large conspiracy, but parallel evolution. They're all dealing with a need coming out in the community. And one of these groups, which I found particularly interesting, was the so-called Vad HaYeshivot, the yeshiva committee, which until last year was the Haredi community's primary vehicle for coordinating service deferrals between the yeshivas and the defense ministry. Essentially, what this body did was keep track of who's learning where, all the pertinent details, and serve as an interlocutor between the yeshivas and the IDF to streamline the granting of exemptions and deferrals for people who were full-time Torah students. Now, until last year, these people received millions of shekels every year in government funding by way of the education ministry. They would sort out the exemptions, and the government would pay them to do it. Their funding got cut off after the court ruling last year, getting rid of the exemptions, but they haven't stopped their activities. Now, what were they doing? That was the question. And one of the things I discovered was that they had sort of expanded their effort to provide advice to yeshiva students, both in terms of public announcements, telling people not to leave the yeshiva, not to go to places where they might interact with authorities, things like that, but also running a hotline where they would tell people explicitly what to do. They would give people advice. Now, I think that's an important point because there's a difference between saying we oppose enlistment in a general ideological way as part of the public discourse and expressly telling an individual asking for advice on what to do as a practical matter and telling them don't enlist. One of them, you could argue, is freedom of speech. The other is explicitly a violation of the law.
So, Sam, what do you do now with this information? Was there a next step, or what is your next step?
Yeah. So the next step on this was to go back to the well, so to speak, and use contacts in the ultra-Orthodox community, parents, yeshiva students, etc., to all of whom, by the way, out of significant fear for their own safety and social standing, demanded to be identified by pseudonyms. There's a lot of social backlash and potentially even violence that could happen if somebody is outed passing on this information to me. So we were very careful to protect that. And so in this case, for instance, one yeshiva student told me that he asked, what do I do with the call-up orders? Ignore it. And don't show up, don't answer, don't respond, is what he was told. Another person received an email. This was explicitly in writing, where they told him the guidance of the sages is unchanged. Do not report under any circumstances and do not cooperate. Of course, according to the law, there's an obligation to report, but these are the instructions of the sages. You are not alone, and many yeshiva students are in the exact same situation in this matter. So they explicitly acknowledge in this email, the law is you have to go, and then they go on to say, but these are the instructions of the sages. And one spokesperson for one ultra-Orthodox politician I spoke to tried to spin this as saying, see, they're saying what the law is. They're explicitly saying what the law is. But the context you have to understand is that this group, in every single communique it puts out to the public through the ultra-Orthodox media, is explicit in saying the guidance of the sages is mandatory. You don't have a choice. Whatever they say, you must do. And the ultra-Orthodox newspapers also frequently will report the big rabbis and the halacha, the Jewish law, states that you have to obey the Vad HaYeshivot and what it says. And their educational system is based on the idea of what they call Das Torah. Think maybe a ultra-Orthodox version of papal infallibility. The big rabbis spent their life learning Torah. They know everything they're talking about, and you must obey them. So, there's a very strong both explicit statement there and a very strong subtext, which sort of militates against the interpretation given by people trying to rework what they're saying.
So Sam, what now? What's the final word on all of this?
So look, there's multiple groups doing this, even ones I haven't touched on. And the one constant that I've been able to find, and I think this is very interesting, is that there appears to have been absolutely no response from law enforcement. These appear to be people who are committing a very serious illegality in the middle of a war. They're doing it, they're not hiding what they do, they're doing it essentially in public. And multiple people have gone to the Attorney General and police to complain. I know of at least one lawmaker, one watchdog group, and an advocacy organization which have complained directly and have said they have received no response from law enforcement or the Attorney General regarding whether or not any sort of probes have been opened. My own questions to the AG and to the police have not been responded to. And these groups have continued to operate, publicly and allegedly illegally in a very, very open way. So I guess the question at this point is, what happens now? And that's something, it's not up for me to say what should happen. I'm a journalist. I'm not an activist. But what I can say is that I think from people I've spoken to, both within and outside the Haredi community, by the way, including people who are Haredi, who are upset with the way things are going, I think that people definitely want to see some action taken on this, or at least understand why action hasn't been.
No, I hear that, Sam. I'm glad we finally got a chance to speak about this. And of course, as we said at the start, it's all very relevant right now because we are in this 2-week period of the vote on the budget, which could or could not bring down this current government. And it's all part of what's at stake right now. So thank you for updating us, and we'll keep on hearing and listening and reading what you have to say. So thanks for being on the Daily Briefing today.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. As always, feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Take care, Shavua Tov, have a good week, and for those still celebrating Purim, Purim Sameach.